Hi, everyone. Excuse, excuse the lack of nuance. I only have about 15 minutes, but let's get right into it. Despite what you may have heard, the idea that blockchain is a useful preservation tool for artwork is mostly, if not totally, a shill from a technical and protocol perspective. However, there are important artworks that utilize smart contracts as essential elements of the work itself. If smart contracts act as performative elements of these works, such as the two seen here, one from Mitchell F. Chan and one from Rhea Myers, the behavior of that work would change in the same way it would be to, say, remove the limbs from a Giacometti sculpture if we did not consider the preservation needs of blockchain itself. I chose a Swiss artist. The art would simply be incomplete. But since blockchain in itself, in many respects, probably isn't actually useful for any of the reasons that probably got you into this to begin with, we have to care about not only the preservation of the born digital and digitized outputs associated with these smart contracts in these cases, which are like less than 10%, but also the forks of blockchains will need preserving in and of themselves. So I wanted to back up and talk a bit more about why people seem to think blockchains are useful for preservation. For one, the decentralization aspect, in theory, creates thousands of redundancies, which could be scaled to millions if enough people had nodes. However, as we know, blockchains were absolutely not created to store large amounts of data, even in terms of like Ethereum and dApps, right? Node and operators actually hate storing lots of data. They already have to maintain and validate multiple terabytes and counting. It's incredibly cost prohibitive as well. And L2s do not make it any better. It's also way more vulnerable from a security perspective, not the answer. But the reality is that most node operators aren't even decentralized. They're using Infura and other centralized products because managing a node is a lot of upkeep. And companies like Infura and even Protocol Labs projects are often using AWS, if you really look into it. Amazon still wins out. It's so super centralized, not decentralized. If Amazon servers go down, how will that affect the entire distributed infrastructure that we seem to be relying upon? It's unlikely anyone in this room, maybe I'm wrong, come up to me after, even manages a node anyway. So you're not even contributing to the lie of blockchain being a preservation tool. Blockchains aren't magical networks in the sky. You should be reminded of that. They're virtual machines that require a ton of hardware and infrastructure. Servers are hard metal, plastic, minerals that someone had to dig up out of the ground for you. It requires a plug. It requires electricity. It requires multiple programming language, not just Solidity, to compile that may be obsolete in 20 years, all the way down. So I want to also talk about the history of time-based media preservation, specifically as it started in about 1996. Just a little history lesson on that. Pip Lawrenson was appointed the first time-based media art conservator at the Tate in 96. Rhizome launched in 96 and is still dedicated to the conservation of net-based artwork. And a very important group in time-based media conservation started actually through a photography conservator, Paul Messier, called the Electronic Media Group. So as you probably have known from the talk yesterday and just at this point in general, media arts is far from being new in itself. It's been around. There's been artists experimenting since the early 1960s. And we've had an interest in solving problematics around preserving variable media since at least 96. And on top of that, there are already ways to combat digital loss that are seemingly completely ignored usually by distributed web communities and the blinding light of blockchain marketing and hype. A great example is NDSA, and you'll see that most museums aren't even at a level 4. You have 4, you can take a pick if you want. And I use this to teach artists and institutions how to consider preserving digital assets. So what have museums historically tended to do with media art acquisitions, which they've been doing for many, many decades, with or without blockchain? By museums, I really want to stress that I mean my museum, Museum of the Moving Image, MoMA, the Tate, the Whitney, and very few others. I'll talk a little bit more about the lack of knowledge and resources across most museums around the world on this topic, even for video art, in the next slide. But quickly, I want to run you through the kind of workflow that I go through every day, acquiring and preserving media art. So the first thing we tend to do is called a pre-acquisition process. And so like I'll become interested in acquiring an artwork that includes variable components, let's just say digital components to make it easy. And at this state, while I'm still just writing a proposal to the institution to vote on the acquisition, I want to understand like what is the artwork technically, right? Like what software was it created in, what programming languages does it use, how easy will it be to for us as an institution to maintain and display the artwork? Is that like actually in our scope? And then that's a whole process. And if the answer is yes, then we ask the artist or estate or the collector to submit something called a submission information package. And what that is never just one file. If you're only working with one file, and I'll say this again, you're doing something wrong. But a submission information package includes something called a checksum, which essentially blockchain is using cryptographic hashes, which are like checksums, supplemental information about the work, images, and then we do the technical artist interview once we have the submission information package and have reviewed it. And that's where we sit down with an artist for sometimes 2, 3, 4 hours to discuss in great detail what is the artwork to them, how are they okay with displaying it and preserving it in the future. I often say that artists will say they don't care how the work's displayed until I ask if it's okay to display it upside down. And then suddenly they have a million things that they require. And so then once we do the technical questionnaire and the museum creates more supplemental information, then we turn it into something called the Archival Information Package, or AIP. And so that's like every file that is associated with the artwork. And we run it through a system that was created through the Library of Congress called Bagger. And that actually creates checksums for the entire bag, as we call it, and all of the pieces in the archival information package and metadata. We use JSONs too outside of blockchain. And then we take that entire information package, at least in our case, and MoMA and a few others, and we have something called a RAID system, which automatically, redundantly stores that data at least twice. Been doing that for a long time before blockchain. And then if, in our case and in many, you have a third-party offsite copy of the work that's held somewhere else, usually in a completely different geographical location, and also on LTO tape, the digital is so vulnerable that it's still best for us to have a copy that's stored on magnetic tape somewhere. And then that has to be switched out every 3 to 5 years. And then there's annual checks to these checksums in this bag every single year, like it's constant upkeep. So the problem is what I was kind of getting to is that there's so few museums who are even capable of doing that. They can't afford conservators. They don't have collection managers on site that understand anything even remotely digital. Again, I'm just talking like simple video work. And so these are the questions I often ask institutions. Do you have a time-based media conservators on staff? The answer is going to like almost always be no. How large is your IT department? Does your IT department even know how to code? It's a real question. Knowledgeable collections managers or registrars, infrastructure for collecting born digital objects. Not a damn. People think that digital asset management systems are the same thing as what I just talked about, but it's not. What we use is called a forensic workstation. That's our RAID system. The FBI and the CIA use the same one. I can get data off your like old computer that you deleted with that thing. True preservation. Anyway, pre-acquisition and acquisition protocols for artworks and digital components. Even the Guggenheim that I love, they don't do pre-acquisition reports, and they're like far ahead of everyone else in terms of time-based media conservation in many ways. And then do you understand your total cost of ownership if you're going to maintain this work over time? Even my institution has issues with that. And then But back to blockchain, when is blockchain even necessary in the preservation conversation? I've come up with 4 different categories for even institutions to even think about this. So I would say that 99, that's a high number, maybe 90% of artworks aren't on-chain at all, have no components behaviorally or performatively that necessitate blockchain. They just use it as a receipt, right? And in that case, I always want to ask the artist and make sure that, the blockchain has nothing to do with the artwork. And if they say it doesn't, that it was just a tool to sell the work, the museum doesn't need to even think about acquiring it that way. It saves them a lot of time. They don't even need to transfer the token, You have to ask the artist, though. And then I talk to artists that say, Jonathan Monahan's an example, where his works don't have to do directly with blockchain or with tokens. However, he wants institutions to acquire it. Like, just hold it anyway. Good. The artist said they care about that. Museum needs to care about that. Then there are works that are partially on chain. So a majority of the work is, on a Web 2.0 site or whatever, or uses Web3.js. This is like most of your 10% of artworks I mentioned, right? And then there's like 0.1% that you could maybe say are fully on chain, but I use autoglyphs here as an example because autoglyphs are not fully on chain. Really, there's nothing fully on chain. You can talk to me about that after, but. And then I did a talk with iBeam about 2 years ago. For artists in the room, you can take a snapshot of this and ask me about it. It's kind of a checklist that you can create to start pairing your own submission information package if you're minting work. Make sure, again, you should never have one file. When you go on sites like Super Rare, they only ask for the thumbnail and maybe like a compressed web copy, and then people think that you can suddenly display that in a museum. Well, it's going to look like crap. So if you want to avoid that, you need the web copy, selected still, exhibition copy, archival copy, which should be uncompressed and lossless if possible. A manual, if it's a more detailed work, more than just a video or a GIF, you're going to want to include instructions on how to maintain the work, what was the work made out of, etc. And what we end up generating that at museums based on questionnaires. But if you have a studio and you have an assistant, like have them write manuals. I always include a plain text file that kind of summarizes the metadata and the manual. So that I feel like plain text files are still going to be readable in like Unicode years from now when everything else fails. It's just like an extra parameter. And run checksums yourself. You can do this directly natively in a Windows and Apple computer. So again, ask me, I can give you instructions on how to do that. Okay, so however, all of the critical stuff I've said, I do really believe we can benefit from actual use of decentralized practices for the purpose of redundantly storing and maintaining born digital and digitized art. And I want museums to be doing this as well. And I've been saying this since 2018. If you want that to be incentivized by cryptocurrency, there's Filecoin, which uses proof of storage mechanisms and is fully EVM compatible. So how am I testing this currently? Kalani Nicole, the brainchild of Transfer Gallery, which is on its way to becoming a nonprofit, and was showing work sold in Bitcoin as early as 2013, has founded a new initiative called Transfer Data Trust. It's received funding from the Knight Foundation and Filecoin Foundation this year, allowing us to pilot special servers, NAS drives, in 6 artist studios, which will be connected via a mesh network, and utilizes IPFS and other infrastructure so that each artist can redundantly store each other's artworks locally. The 6 artists will be paired with conservation assistants who will help properly document and prepare the AIPs I talked about for the works. And just like our earlier project, Pieces of Me, in 2021, sales of artwork will go directly back into the trust and be distributed to artists and collaborators who will bank their time. Eventually, I hope to use LTO tape on top of the redundant local decentralized storage we're using. And the best part is once we complete the pilot and the infrastructure, it will all be open source, so anybody can use this system that we're building. 2 artists you'd be familiar with who are part of the pilot program are Lorna Mills and Carla Ganis. There's an artisan fund for the project if you're interested in supporting. And find me after the talk if interested. And as I have hoped since 2017, 2018, museums are closer than ever to adopting the use of decentralized redundant storage, with or without blockchain. It's just more about DWeb principles. There's still a way to go in solving encryption needs, and we don't have time to get into the encryption issues with that, but they're on their way. We're working with partners like Fission doesn't exist anymore, but their team members we're still talking with on this topic. And they used all open source materials too, so that made it easy. And I know ZocKM at one point tried to involve protocol labs in their infrastructure, and I believe it failed at the time, but it was early. And as we say, we're early, right? So I think we need to start thinking about this again. So I mentioned, so this is exciting, hopefully, to all of you, that we are thinking about more museums adopting redundant, decentralized storage protocols. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we still have to consider the preservation of the blockchain itself. The chance that most of these blockchains won't be dead chains in the next 20, 25 years is actually surprisingly low. So, before I get there though, quickly, this is another example of what a AIP might look like when you're putting in an IPFS. So you might see like on a platform, just like the GLB for this bust, right? Like on Tezos or something. But these are all the files that have to go into that in an AIP. So if you're an artist, start thinking about your work as something that needs multiple files upon upload. And I actually call this a pre-minting process. So the way to get around platforms with this is you create your AIP or your SIP, and you upload it to IPFS first. You generate the link, and then you include the link in your description on a platform, because they don't have the field for this kind of stuff. So back to what I was talking about, we have to think about how to preserve blockchains. And I gave a talk with John Apolito and John Bell at Isaiah and iPres 2 years ago, where we talked about the need to emulate these blockchains. It's not necessarily that difficult. I need to really start like playing around and doing this myself. But the idea is like, I believe institutions will have to eventually fork their own blockchain, run a single node. It could be like just a local environment, and that existing just so that we can properly perform the works that involve smart contracts as behavioral, right? But you'll see here that it's not a straightforward process. You need multiple systems and softwares and development knowledge to make that possible. And I always kind of laugh to myself that the future of blockchain preservation is going back to everything else in the art world, where eventually we'll be writing NEA grants to preserve this stuff, not using crypto. And I don't know if I think that's a good thing, but that's the reality. Thank you.